Hi. Hi. I'm Jack, and this is Straight Talk About God video. And we're all about the lost tribes this time. It took me 26 weeks of 1-hour shows to go through all this material. So who knows how many hours it's going to take this time. But today will just be an overview on all the different subjects, and we'll fill in a lot of details later on. So there's not a lot of scripture references or anything. This is just to kind of give you a whole gestalt of the whole Lost Tribes teaching. Okay? But first I want to outline how why it is we're doing this. Okay? This isn't just some neat historical study. Okay? That's not the reason we're here. The reason I'm presenting this intent of this whole study is as a basis of faith. Faith is the only thing that saves us. That's what all the New Testament says. Faith. And I have to put in here that the faith in the Bible is not the faith that we have in English. The faith that we have in English just sits there. Because it doesn't move. It doesn't act. It's a belief. What faith are you? What belief are you? Keep the faith. Keep the belief. None of that stuff applies to Greek and Hebrew faith, because Greek and Hebrew faith are verbs. They're all verbs. Even when the verb name is used as a name of the process, it still has a movement involved. Just the same way bath it's a noun, but it's the name of an active thing. Okay? You take a bath. Okay? You bathe. Okay? Well, you bathe. And let's go to Jesus. Either Jesus was a nut, a fraud, or he was the Son of God. Okay? Son of God. And we're going to take a look at that, and then we have to notice that Buddha never said he was the Son of God. Muhammad never said he was the Son of God. You know, Confucius, he didn't even think about the spiritual part. You know, major belief systems, not promoted by the Son of God. Okay. Well, you know, a lot of the things that Jesus said, either he was crazy because no human being could ever possibly do the things he did, lived in heaven, saw Satan cast out, lived forever, you know. That's what Jesus said. So, if he was crazy and believed all this stuff, okay. If he wasn't crazy and said all that stuff, then he knew that he was lying, because no human ever was in heaven and came back to tell everybody about it, saw Satan fall. None of that stuff. My death would fix all the bad stuff about the whole world. You know, Buddha didn't say that kind of stuff. But Jesus did. So he was a fraud. But if he wasn't a nut and he wasn't a fraud, there's only one option left. He was the Son of God. And that's the reason he could say all that stuff. Okay? Well, where do we find all this? Find out about Jesus. You know, mostly the Gospels, a few odd other places. Hypothetical Q document is around, and they all say the same things about Jesus. You know, he said this, he said that, he did that. You know, he was the Son of God. Well, fulfilled prophecy is one of the greatest tests of the truth. Okay? It says the test of a prophet is if he says what he says comes true. Okay? Fulfilled prophecy. And the prophecy about Jesus is all over the Old Testament, especially Isaiah, you know. But that's pretty hard to prove. You know, you can't prove that by going to the library. Huh? You can't prove that by going to the library. You have to do some very heavy, in-depth study with a lot of outside books to put everything together to say, yep, he came out of the tomb. The evidence says he came out of the tomb. Not so with the lost tribes. Lost tribes, you can do it overnight. Well, overnight. No, it's not overnight. It's a continuing study for 4 or 5 years, but it's so simple, easy to do, simple. A lot of hard work, but simple. Any 12-year-old could do it, okay? Because all you need is the Bible, a little bit of knowledge about who's being talked about, who's being talked to, and what's being said, and when this prophecy that's talked to them about is going to come true. What's the time frame? Then all you need after that is a bunch of history books. Go to any library, and anybody can do that. See? Fulfilled prophecy. Okay? There's one prophecy that we can mention is Alexander's conquering of Tyre. Okay, Tyre was prophesied. Where was prophesied in Ezekiel 26 that the city would be leveled, and nothing would be left but the bare foundational rocks, upon which the fishermen would dry their nets. That town would be non-existent, just gone, boom. And that's what happened. Successive conquerings wiped out that whole city, gone. And they took all the rubble and nothing but the rocks were left. And fishermen did their nets on the rocks. There's more to the story, but that's a fulfilled prophecy. Well, that must be true. The Bible's pretty good. Okay. Well, there's another thing that we want to investigate, and that's the misconception that whatever these prophecies that we're reading pertain to either Jesus or the Jews or the church. And none of them in the Lost Tribes teaching, none of the prophecies pertain to any one of those three. You see, but because there's a heavy crossroads that we're going to get to, where it shows that there was a split in the 12 tribes, and 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, became the lower southern kingdom, a nation, and they were called Jews. The people in the north, the 10 tribes, they were never called Jews. See, so you go to a prophecy and it says the children of Israel did blah blah blah, the house of Israel did da 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 da, or they're going to do da da da. Well, you think Jews? It must be the Jews. There are 12 tribes of Jews. No, they're not. See? Then you go look around in history and you can't find where it came true. It said, this is going to happen. You can't even hardly find all the Jews, let alone that the prophecy happened. You say, well, oh God, read the Bible and it's not the Jews. Well, it must be Jesus. Oh, it pertains to Jesus. And you look in, well, those prophecies don't pertain to Jesus. They pertain to the house of Israel. And the house of Israel is not the church. Oh, well, the believers become the spiritual seed of Abraham. Paul said so. That doesn't make them the bloodline descendants of the house of Israel, those 10 tribes. See? And the Lost Tribes teaching is all about the house of Israel and its other 8 or 9, 10 names. Okay? That's the big problem. Nobody recognizes the names. And you can't pin these prophecies unless you know about that on the proper people. Famous atheist, Ingersoll, in Britain, he said, hey, you can't believe the Bible. It's not true. All the prophecies that God gave to the Jews, he gave to England. Well, he didn't know that England was the house of Israel. Well, one of the reasons why this house of Israel, this Lost Tribes teaching didn't happen the way it's supposed to happen is because, it's a truth of God. It proves God's existence. Okay, that's why we're doing this thing, to prove God, so that we can depend on the other stuff that we can't prove. Okay? The Lost Tribes proves God. Well, Satan's going to get in on that, okay? And the first group that really pushed the Lost Tribes identity stuff, okay, now it's called an identity movement, the identity people, okay, is the British Israel people over in Britain. Okay, around 1800, this news came out, they discovered all the stuff, and they started pushing, they got together, made a movement out of it, and Satan got in there and said, well, this is good for your ego. You're special people. You know, you're the chosen people of God. Wow, you're the people of the Bible. Wow, you're great. Oh, you're so good. And they became white supremacists. You know, for the most part, you know, used to be anyway. One of them, Richard Brothers, demanded that the king step down and he be made the ruler. I'm an Israelite. I belong to, you know. So, you ask 100 pastors about the identity movement. Oh, identity, no, that's straight out of the devil there. Well, they're mostly right, you know, but it's not the identity movement that we're worried about. We're looking at God's word of prophecy to certain people that came true and proves his existence so that we can depend on what he says when he promises to provide for us. Okay? And we'll get into Abraham's background. That's a pretty wonderful piece of study. Abraham's background. He lived with his father Terah in Babylon. You know, very near Nimrod, the king of Babylon. He lived for 275 years, you know, and Terah was in the court of Nimrod. Okay. Well, through circumstances that we'll get into later, when Abraham is born, after he's born and he's 10 years old, Terah ships him off to Noah and Shem. Shem outlived Abraham. Why? Yeah. He spent 39 years with Noah and Shem. And they weren't talking about fishing. Huh? He was learning about God. That's why God picked out him to do the chosen people thing and to build a family and to build a nation. He didn't just pick out some nomad wandering around the desert, you know, and say, huh? Oh, what, God? Oh, you want me to what? No. He was way on God's side a long time before that. In fact, Shem, sometime after Noah left living with them, he went over to Egypt and conquered Ham, because Ham was doing some bad stuff. And you'll find in history a place where in Egypt they became a monotheistic religion. See? That was the first wave of the Hyksos. There were two Hyksos that went to Egypt and ruled. Hyksos only means either foreign king or shepherd king, which is what the Israelites were. They were shepherds. Okay? So, in our study of Abraham, we're going to have to look at some promises that God made, unconditional promises that God made to Abraham. He says, your seed is going to be like the stars of heaven. You know, you won't be able to count them. Well, that didn't happen for a long time. A long time. I mean, in Egypt, they became maybe 3 million, 2.5 to 3.25 million people. That's pretty big. That's a nation. But you can number that many. Stars and sand. How about 1 billion? 1 billion. That pretty well fits. Okay? And that's how many there are today. Maybe more. 1 billion of them. You can't find them all. God, eh? But he made that unconditionally. He said, that's what's going to happen. Boom. Another thing he said, they're going to, the gates of their enemies. When they become this big, way down in history today, there are going to be kings and multiple nations come out of you. See? You know, and one of the things that we really have to zero in on is the crossroads, as Dr. Scott used to call it, of history, in Genesis 48 and 49. See, in Genesis 48 and 49 is where we find the split that happens in the nation, okay? Because it just goes by, you know, it doesn't say this is a split, da 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 da. It just goes by and you read by it, and then 450, 500 years later, maybe 700 years later, the actual split occurs. And the 10 tribes go and become a nation by themselves, and the 2 tribes of Judah on the south become a nation. You know, 800 years later, see, because you just read right by it in Genesis. Basically what happened, we'll get into it in detail, Jacob in 48, he adopts Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and he adopts them as his first and second born. Whew, puts him right at the top of the list, you know, and makes some promises to him. And then in 49, Jacob says, here's what's going to happen to you in the latter days today, when this big population group is happening from Abraham. So all that stuff is but the end times. He said, this is what's going to happen. He goes through the blessing of all the tribes, giving them blessings and saying this is going to happen, blah, da, 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 da. This is part of the birthright. This is his birthright promise to him. He gives them all the stuff that he can give them and tells them what's going to happen, and, you know, okay. But the birthright doesn't go like it's supposed to. It always goes to the firstborn. Reuben didn't get it. In first place, he wasn't the firstborn anymore. Ephraim was the firstborn, and his older brother, who was really the firstborn of Joseph, Manasseh, was the second tribe. He was the number 1 and number 2. Okay. So as Jacob goes down the line, he passes over Reuben, he passes over Simeon and Levi for other reasons, and he lands in Judah. Judah is now the one that would receive the whole birthright, but he doesn't give it to him. He only gives him the right to rule the family and to be the keeper of the law. You want to know what the law of God is, you go to Judah. He's the repository of the law. That's all he got. Poor Judah. You know, he thought he was in line for everything. He didn't get anything. He got to be the king. Big deal. Okay? Joseph got everything. He got all the land, all the cattle, all the rings and the perfume, all that stuff, see? And all the promises. Because those promises, those 3 unconditional promises that went to Abraham, passed to Isaac. You can read about it. And they passed on to Jacob. Now, Jacob's descendants are going to be like the stars of the heaven. They'll possess the gates of their enemies and all that stuff. And what does Jacob do with that? He gives it to Joseph. The Jews are never going to possess the gates of their enemies, no matter what time in history you look. Okay? They don't even today. They're one of the big nuclear nations in the world, and they don't possess the gates of their enemies. See, somebody else does. See? The house of Israel. They got it because they are Ephraim, and Manasseh. So if you don't take that into consideration, you're looking around for all these fulfilled prophecies, and you can't find any of them, and you have to spiritualize it and say, oh, well, that's the church. That's not the church. Okay? Because if that's the church, then all of that other stuff has got to be the church, and none of it other fits. You know, you pick out a little bit, and that kind of makes sense. And the rest of it doesn't make sense. You know? Oh, well, there's 1 billion Christians today. It must be the church. It's not the church. Okay? It's the house of Israel. The house of Israel, which happens to be Christian nations anyway, but the prophecy isn't fulfilled by Christians. The Christians don't own the gates of their enemies. See? So, the Bible can't be true. That's even confirmed in 1 Chronicles 5:1, where it says that Judah would reign, but Joseph got the birthright. Mouth of 2, a thing is confirmed. Adequate witness. And that split, we'll talk about Ezekiel 23. Ezekiel 23. Ezekiel, when did Ezekiel live? Huh? Wasn't he around in the Babylonian captivity? 600 to 585 BC? Huh? How long after Egypt was 600 BC? Huh? They went into Egypt around 1800. No, yeah, 1800 some. Came out 1453. Huh? That's almost 1,000 years. 1,000 years later, Ezekiel says, down in Egypt, there were two sisters, Aholah and Aholibah, and they went whoring. That's idol worship. God always uses adultery and whoring, sex stuff, bad sex, for idol worship. They were down there in Egypt and they were whoring around. Wait a minute. That was all one big family. All the 12 tribes were down there in Egypt. They lived there for 400 years. They came out, they traveled around for 40 years, they got into the promised land. They were one people. They were one people until they got a king, Saul, and then David became king, and then Solomon became king. They were all one people. But when Solomon died, then they split. That was 721 BC. The split, they were already split in Egypt when Jacob split the birthright. That's when it split. See? And that was around 1800 BC. Aholah and Aholibah. Jeroboam. I need to talk about Jeroboam. We're going to get into him. This has to do with the kingdom splitting. Okay? Jeroboam is met by a prophet. He says, the kingdom is going to split. You're going to be ruler of the 10 tribes. And Judah, with Benjamin along for a light to them, is going to be the southern kingdom. There'll be 2 complete kingdoms. And they were for 200 years. They warred against each other. They went to war with each other 200 years, as long as we've been in existence here in the United States. And that includes one of the times when the king of Israel, house of Israel, now upper northern tribes, the king of Israel called upon the king of Syria. He was named Rezin. Pekah was Israel, and King Rezin was from Syria. He said, hey, come on down here and help me war with these guys. He came down, and they were making war, and they're getting ready, and they took the name, the name Israelite, Jebusite, Canaanite, all these ites. Well, the tribes of the southern kingdom of Judah were Judahites, right? Judahites. Okay. They were already Judahites, but in 2 Kings 11, they just shortened the name down and called them Jews. That's all, just Jews. See? And really, it was only technically that the Benjamites were called Jews because they were in the kingdom of Judah. After the Babylonian captivity, they split off and they went up in Galilee. They didn't want anything to do with those Judahites, I guess. They went in there to do their whole thing. Only the tribe of Judah, the bloodline tribe of Judah, are real Jews. Are real Jews. Benjamin was only with them until the nation got carried away. They were just pseudo-Jews. Along with that history that we have to mention right now, there's a king, the 6th king of the house of Israel, the 10 tribes in northern Israel. He was like Hammurabi. He made a bunch of laws, and he changed the capital to Samaria instead of Bethel, Samaria. And he was a big, well-known king in the area and did a lot of stuff, okay? His name was Omri, O-M-R-I. But they didn't say they said Hum. So it was like a K-H, Humri. Humri was his name. Okay, that's good for later on. Okay, starting around 745 BC, the Assyrian Empire rose to ascendance, came down, and started conquering. Wave after wave of armies came down and conquered all of Israel, all of Palestine, okay, with a few exceptions. They started on the east side of the Jordan River and took away Reuben and Gad and it's called the half tribe of Manasseh. They all lived on the east side of the Jordan. Okay, it took them away first. They were the easiest to get to. Then they went over the Jordan later on. A couple of waves of conquering went down, took the whole nation of Israel, maybe 6 million of them. The whole nation, took them away, lock, stock, and barrel. There was not anybody left. See? They even tried, and it took a whole lot of Jews. They say something like hundreds of thousands of Jews along with that, because they conquered the whole of Palestine except a few places, and especially Jerusalem. Sennacherib came down to take care of Jerusalem, and he ran into trouble and quit, and that was basically the end of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, but they took all of the Israelites away, not the Judahites, the Israelites away, took them out and put them between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, underneath the Caucasus Mountains. Some of them were under the Caspian Sea and came around on the east side of the Caspian Sea across the top and then went west. Okay, but from the position under the Caspian, under the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea, they spent a bunch of time there, and then a big group of them split off and went under the Black Sea and over into the Aegean Sea and northern Mediterranean, Italy and Spain around in there. The other group, the bigger group, larger group of Israelites, went up through the Caucasus Mountains, through the Dariel Pass, which is at the headwaters of the Euphrates River. They went through there up into what became known as Scythia. Scythia. Arsareth is on some maps, which means place of rest. Okay. What's next here? Assyrian invasion. One of the reasons they put them up there was to form a buffer state between them, millions of people, between them and their enemies, the Medes. Okay, so the Assyrians and the Medes were at it, but the Israelites, these millions of people, are stuck in the middle. So if the Medes want to come and make trouble, they got to go through the Israelites first. And that's the first time in history they ever did that. Relocated a whole bunch of people and set them down in a different place. Okay, and the rule was kind of loose over them, but they were still under the thumb. But a lot of them became mercenaries. What do you do when you don't have a job? You're a mercenary. And they joined with the Medes. There's evidence that they dug up one of the wooden gates of Jerusalem from the time of the Babylonian war. And they had very special kinds of arrow points that they found in the door. Okay? Arrows were shot into the door, and these arrow points were triangular. They weren't flat, they were triangular, like a long, tall triangle. See? The only people ever had those were Israelites and Scythians. Some of the mercenary Israelites came down and helped Nebuchadnezzar beat up on their brothers Judah in Jerusalem. Okay. Okay. Oh, you find the passage through the Euphrates headwaters in 2nd Esdras. 2nd Esdras? Where's that? That comes from the Apocrypha. Used to be in the Bible. It was taken out. Okay, but they're in the Apocrypha. There's 1st and 2nd Esdras. 1st and 2nd Esdras means when you look at 1st Esdras and read it, compare it with the book of Ezra in the Bible. See, Esdras is only the Greek way of saying Ezra. Okay, but you read 1st Ezra and Ezra in the Bible, they're the same, almost verbatim. But 2nd Esdras isn't there. But in 2nd Esdras, there's a lot of prophecy, and one of the things that they detail isn't prophecy, but the detail is that the lost tribes said, hey, we're done with this. We want to go a place where we can live our own lives. And they went up through the pass, like I mentioned. That's in 2nd Esdras, chapter 2 and chapter 13. So, the lost tribes got their name because they got lost, right? Lost, you know? After it says that the Assyrians came down and finally laid siege to Samaria and broke the city down in 721, that's the official date, the 721 BC, and carried them away to the places I mentioned, that's in there, right up by the Lake Van and up in there. They disappear from the Bible. We have no idea what happened to them. And because we don't have any idea what happened to them, and nobody knows about all this stuff about the house of Israel, oh, they got assimilated. You know, 6 million of them? No, they didn't get assimilated. They became their own nation. Okay? One of the Darius kings, well, we'll get into that later. But most of our history is what they call Greco-Roman history, right? This is what the world was like. Blah, 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 blah. We were the Greeks, and we were the Romans, and well, everybody else in the world, never mind their cultural achievements, everybody else were called barbarians. You know, they weren't Conan running around naked with a sword. No matter what they were barbarians. If you're not a Roman, you're a barbarian. We're the elite Romans. Everybody else is trash. You know. Well, a couple of places called Hallstatt and Latine over in mid-Europe were dug up, where we know the Israelites were, and some fantastic jewelry and things were there. High culture was dug up for these barbarians. They weren't barbarians, okay? But that's, you know, those Celts, they, you know, well, and you see Celts in the movies, sometimes, you know, they're these crazy people, you know, crazy warring people. Well, we know what the Scythians were. Okay, Scythians, they were in the steppes of Russia, and you read the history books and different accounts, and it says, well, we don't really know where they came from. They probably came from the east. They migrated from the east. Well, okay, let's take the history of the Bible, and it says that all of those Israelites, millions of them, went up through the mountains and went into that same place where the history people talk about the Scythians. Well, the Scythians are there. Yeah, we know about the Scythians. See? And you can start with the Scythians and travel all the way with them, different groups, breaking off and settling as they went over all the way into Northwest Europe and the British Isles. That's documented history. Well, what happened to the Israelites? How did these millions of Scythians and these millions of Israelites inhabit the same place and we don't hear about it? You know, Dr. Scott used to say there used to be the greatest collision in history, you know, the greatest war that we ever had, and nobody talked about it, you know, or they're the same people. The Israelites are the Scythians. You know, the name comes from Sukkoth, which means booth. You know, the Feast of Sukkoth, tabernacles, where they build temporary structures to remind them what it was like when they went around the desert for 40 years, building temporary structures. The Scythians were nomads. They were like the gypsies. They had wagons and their flocks, and they went with all their stuff, and they just went around. Okay? So the name Scythian isn't a Hebrew word. It comes from Scuth, Booth, the Scythians, the Scythians. And when the language is changed, then we have the Scythians. We don't have the Israelites. You know, the names got changed. The names got lost, not the people. Okay. Okay. Disappearance in the mountains. See, okay, now there's a couple of ways that we really know that this is true, not just the Bible, okay? As I said, you go to the history books, okay? Well, there's a gold tablet, there's a Behistun rock, huge rock face carved out, okay? And there's border reports from the guards of the Assyrians about what was going on in the area that they put the Israelites in, up there underneath the Caucasus Mountains. But none of these reports talk about the Israelites, the house of Israel, Judah. That none of those names apply. See? Why not? A different language. Different language. The people under the Black Sea were called the Khumri because they came from, the people of George Washington, the people of King Khumri. He was so well known throughout history that hundreds of years later, there he is, 100 years later, they're called the people of Khumri, the Khumri. Khumri in Greek becomes Kamerioi. And when you translate the Greek Kamerioi out of Greek into English, it's the Sumerians. Okay? See, the names just got lost. They didn't call them the Israelites. Over east, underneath the Black Sea, they call them the Saka, because the Israelites called themselves, a lot of them, the house of Isaac, which you can find in the Bible, a couple of places. House of Isaac, Isaac. Well, Isaac easily becomes Sak or Saka, and in Greek it becomes Sakasuni. Sakasuni, the Sakasuni, the sons of Saka, the Saxons. The Saxons, yeah, they become the Saxons. We know the Saxons. The names got changed, that's all. On Behistun Rock it even says that in 3 different languages, it says these people came from Cana. K-A-N-A. Well, that's where they came from, the land of Canaan. Okay, Behistun Rock and the border reports. 23,000 tablets were dug up over there. Okay. See? So the Celts are the recipients of those promises. Now we can take those promises, lay those promises on the Celts and see if they did any of that stuff. Right? Let's see. Deuteronomy 33 says they're going to push the people to the ends of the earth. That's what the colonizers sure did. The Jews didn't do that, but the French, the Dutch, the British, they pushed everybody to the ends of the earth, right? The British Empire never saw the sunset. They were all the way over to India. They were a world empire, a company of nations, as promised to Abraham. You see, because who wound up being the nobility of all the tribes? Well, Joseph. He got everything. He got all the riches. He was the richest guy around. The tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim were the nobility of the 12 tribes. Judah was the king. Yeah, that's good. But these guys had everything. They were high mucky mucks, And Ephraim was the headquarters tribe of the 10 tribes, the house of Israel. And they still are, because Ephraim is the main body of populace of Britain. That was founded by Ephraim. Manasseh was in there too, okay, because Manasseh had to come out of Britain and come over to the United States and found the United States, and we'll get into that. So the birthright promises, which you can look in the Bible and they never happened, okay? The house of Israel never got those birthright promises in the promised land. They got them over in England, Britain, starting around 1800, which we'll get into. The punishment period came up, and now they could be awarded the promises of the birthright. And that's when the British Empire really started to blossom, okay, 1800s. And one last word about that. Gates of their enemies. Remember, that was all the way back to Abraham. And it was adequate witness prophesied to Isaac's future wife. When she was leaving home to come to be Isaac's wife, her sister, or her mother, or both of them, prophesied and said, yeah, boom, gates of the enemies, gates of those who hate you. Well, again, the Jews don't qualify. But who owns Suez? Gibraltar, Cape of Good Hope, Panama Canal, Cape Horn, Hong Kong, Falkland Islands. They're all Britain and the United States, The tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. Came true. It's already true. And you don't have to have any more than your grade school, high school history, which is really crap to begin with, But you don't need any more than that to know that Britain controlled the Suez Canal and Gibraltar, and the U.S. controlled Panama Canal. You don't need that's in the news practically, Gateways of Europe. But after the nation split, Nebuchadnezzar, he said, hey, what's going to happen? And these soothsayers, prophets of Nebuchadnezzar, said, well, the prophecy says to David, it says he'll always have a man on the throne. There'll always be a descendant of David ruling. Nebuchadnezzar says, well, wait a minute. We're not going to take any chances and have some crazy old Jew over here. And he said, well, I'll take care of them. Okay? So when he conquers Jerusalem and the whole southern nation, starting in two or three different waves like the Assyrians did, the last conquering, when Jerusalem finally falls after a siege, he takes the king, Zedekiah, and all 7 of his sons, takes them out wherever he took them, kills all the sons in front of him, kills them all, then puts out Zedekiah's eyes and takes him back to Babylon, and he dies there. Line cut. No, it's not. See, because they knew the prophecy to David, they knew about all that and the line, but they were all working on the Babylonian law, which they assumed was the same law because it was every place else, that only the males can inherit. So if he kills all the male kids, all the princes, no more line, line's cut. But way, way back, in the first 5 books, you'll find where some of the girls of one of the family members came to Moses. He said, Dad died, and we don't have any brothers, and I don't think it's fair that nobody should get our inheritance. We should be able to keep our inheritance. He says, okay, I'll ask God. God says, yep, do that. So now, if there's no male, the line can pass through to the female. Well, Zedekiah, he's got 2 daughters. See? He's got 2 daughters. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know that. He thinks he cut the line off, but he didn't. And that's where Jeremiah comes in. See? David's kingdom. We have to talk about that a little bit. He ruled for 40 years from the Nile all the way over to the Euphrates River, all the way to the southern coast, way up north to the mountains. Big area, the whole Middle East, except Iran. He ruled 40 years. But Nathan, the prophet, comes and he says, you're going to be a ruling dynasty forever. That's what Nebuchadnezzar knew. He said, also, the people of Israel are going to have a place of their own where they'll never move anymore, and where their enemies will be far away. It won't bother them anymore. Well, weren't they already in the promised land and at peace for 40 years? And who thought about moving around, you know? Well, he's talking about the lost tribes going over to Northwest Europe and being there for thousands of years until the end of the age, you know, when the millennium starts and Jesus returns and all that. They're going to be there and they'll stay there. They won't move anymore. See? They move up from in the Caucasus Mountains, and then they'll move over to Arsareth and across Europe and everything, and then they'll wind up in Northwest Europe. The female inherits. What happens to those daughters? That's where Jeremiah comes in. Jeremiah takes those daughters eventually and travels north. He lets one of them off in Spain, supposedly to marry one of the kings in Spain, which were Israelites. And then he takes the other daughter, Tia Tephi is her name, takes her to Ireland, marries her off to the High King of Ireland, who is a Milesian. Now, Miletus is way over in the Aegean Sea, right? The people of Miletus. So there were a lot of migrations from the North Mediterranean across the Mediterranean into Spain, eventually up into Ireland, up into Scotland, the Norway, and up in the North Sea. And as it happens, we'll get into this in more detail, but the daughter is out of the line of Pharez. And the king is out of the line of Zara. Well, Zara is the firstborn of Judah. Remember Judah? He got the right to be the king. Yeah. So Zara has the right to be the king because he's the firstborn. And he rules in Egypt. Okay? The Israelites ruled Egypt for 250 years. You know, Joseph ruled for 80 years. And they were doing so good there in Egypt. The Egyptians loved them. They had to. Everything was prosperous. Everything was going fine. They were doing real well. Why change rulers? The Pharaoh was up on the Giza Plateau in the pool and enjoying the sun. You know, yeah, you run things down there, fine, and everything will be great. 250 years after Joseph dies, who did Jacob say rules? Zara, firstborn, Judah, okay? And Diodorus Siculus says that there were 2 exoduses out of Egypt, one by sea, one by land. The one by land is the one from Moses. Who was the one by sea? The first chapter of Exodus tells the story about that, because it says that, now there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. 250 years later, this Pharaoh says, hey, wait a minute. Oh, who was this Joseph guy? I want to rule the whole thing. He came down and he took over. Well, he didn't just walk in and say, I'm the ruler now. You know, he had to bring an army down there. He had to take over, put those people into servitude. What happens in a revolution like that? The rulers get away. The nobility, out, boom. See? That's why the Pharez line, which is the second line, supplied the bloodline for David and Jesus because Zara wasn't around. All the Zarahites migrated even earlier than that up into the northern Mediterranean and across over to the British Isles eventually. And they were there waiting when the lost tribes showed up so that Judah could rule the lost tribes. Simple. You know, even though it took 1,000 years. Simple. Right? What else? Jeremiah also, besides the daughter, he brings a big rock and other relics to Ireland with him. Okay? What is that rock? That rock is the coronation stone of Israel. The whole nation of Israel. Okay? Then, after the split happens, it's the coronation stone of the southern kingdom of Judah. Until Jeremiah takes it away. Where'd they get that stone? It's called Jacob's pillow, or Jacob's pillar. We'll get into that in a lot of detail, but Jacob sees in a dream, a vision, he sees the ladder from heaven and the angels coming up and going down, and he's on his way out to Haran, to his distant cousin uncle, to get a wife and get away from Esau. Okay? And he says, wow, this must be the place of God. And he named that rock where he put his pillows on to go to sleep, he named that rock the house of God. Bethel. Beth-El. House of God. Bethel. Well, don't you know that on the way back from Haran, with all his servants and his giant cattle, the whole family and everything, he didn't pick up that rock when he went and came back down into the Holy Land and kept it with him, and kept it with him when he went to Egypt to live with Joseph and then died there, right? And it's even talked about as the shepherd's stone in Genesis 49 when Jacob says, passes out the birthright. Okay? But Ezekiel says about that stone that it's going to be overturned 3 times. Actually, it's the stone is the symbol of the throne. Okay? It's the symbol of the throne. And the throne will be overturned 3 times. The Israelite throne will be overturned 3 times. Well, the first time is when Zedekiah loses it to Nebuchadnezzar, and the kingship, the rulership of the family goes to one of Zedekiah's daughters. And that goes into Ireland. And that's the first overturn from Israel to Ireland. It stays there for about 1,000 years. And then it goes to Scotland, 500 AD. And then in 1200 AD, it goes to England. And it's the coronation stone that sits under the chair in the coronation chair in England. It's back over in Scotland now, but see. So that's the third overturn. And it says in the Bible that in Ezekiel, then it won't be overturned anymore. The throne won't be overturned anymore. The rulership of David's line will never be overturned again until Shiloh comes, whose right it is to claim that throne. Jesus. That's why the English monarchy is such an anachronism. You know? What do they need a royalty for? They have a parliament. They pass all the laws. They do all that stuff. What's the Queen do? Except tax the citizens so that she can warm her 800 palaces or whatever. You know, what do they need? I mean, aren't we out of the king days? There's no kings left. You know, there's Netherlands and a couple. You know, what do you need king for? Because God said that the king will be ruled until Jesus comes. You know, about Judah. How that all happens. You know, you go to Genesis 38, okay? And if you look at 37, 38, and 39, you say, well, wait a minute. What's 38 in there for? What is that, you know? Because you can take 38 straight out of the story, start back in 37 about the last 5 verses, read those 5 verses, and then read the first 5 verses in 39. There's no break. It's a continuous story. Boom. But there's 38 stuck in there. Well, God didn't do that for no reason. Okay? It's all about Judah and those 2 sons. Okay? It establishes who's going to rule. That's what it establishes. But you read right by all that stuff and you don't make the connections. See? Well, Tamar is married to Judah's firstborn son. Okay? Firstborn son. Well, he was a bad guy and he died. It says God killed him. Okay? So the tradition was that if the first husband dies and there's no kids, then one of his brothers has to take that wife on and have kids for her by him, for the dead brother, for the inheritance thing, okay? They did that all the time. That was no big thing. Well, the second brother, he went in and he did a bad thing and God killed him. See? And Judah says, "Oh, wait, my young boy here, I don't want him to die too. I tell you what, Tamar, you go back to your father's house. Okay? You live there, be your widow and stuff until Shelah is old enough, and then you can get married." But he doesn't keep his promise because he gets old enough to marry and he doesn't do it. See? Well, Tamar finds out that Judah is going to go on a trip, shear some sheep, okay? And she says, okay. She dresses herself up like a prostitute and sits on the road where she knows that he's going to pass by. Well, he passes by and he says, So they go in and he said, well, wait a minute. What are you going to give me? He said, well, I'll give you a sheep. I'll give you a lamb out of the flock. Well, yeah, but where's the lamb? I don't have one now. What can you give me as an earnest that you come later and give me the lamb? He said, well, so he gives her his staff and his ring and stuff, and he sends his servant back later with the lamb, and he looks around and he can't find anybody. He asks the people around her. He says, "Where's that prostitute that was around here?" "Prostitute? We don't know any prostitute around here. There's nobody around here." Okay. Well, I tried. Goes back to Judah. About 3 or 4 months later, somebody comes to Judah and says, "Hey, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, she's been playing the whore. She's pregnant." "What? Bring her here. We'll burn her." That's what they did. Burn her. She gets her and she says, "Oh, by the way, whose staff is this? Whose ring is this?" He says, "Well, you were more honest than I was. We won't have anything to do with each other anymore, but you're okay." She has twins. The midwife knows that there's twins in there, and the good midwife always has a way to mark the firstborn. It's extremely important. The firstborn gets everything, okay? So she's there, and she's got a red cord ready, and arm comes out. He wraps the red cord around the arm, and the arm goes back in. A little bit later, a whole baby comes out. But it's not the same one. It's the other one. Then the one with the red cord comes out. So they probably had a lot of back and forth about who was firstborn, but Zara with the red cord is the firstborn. That's why you see the red hand in Ulster. That's why we have red tape. The official thing is red tape. Okay? Zara. So Zara definitely is going to rule when Joseph dies, because the line of Judah is given rulership by Jacob, And Judah's long dead by the time Joseph dies. He's dead for a long time. You know, he might have been dead before the family even went down there to Egypt. Maybe not. But he was dead by the time another 80 years for. He was one of the first four kids born, you know. He was probably 30 or so before Benjamin was even born. So, remember the first Hyksos? Joseph. They were the second wave of Hyksos. The second foreign rulers. And after the Exodus, they went and scrambled everything around. You couldn't find anything anymore. There's some places where they found things, but they got rid of all that stuff because they hated them, you know? What did they do? You look around in history. Dr. Scott used to say that you look in history of Egypt, and there's a certain time around 1300 BC where they collapsed into a very poor nation. There was nothing left of them. They were not a world power anymore. Why? Because the whole Pharaoh's army and Pharaoh got drowned in the Red Sea. You know, God covered them over with water. Nothing left. Okay? So, they didn't take very kindly to that and went around erasing all the stuff about the Israelites, those dirty, rotten shepherd kings. Those were the second wave of the Hyksos kings. Okay? Second wave. Joseph rules Egypt. After, well, we already talked about the leaders leaving, you know, before the Pharaoh came down and the army. But during the Egyptian period, during that 250 years while they were ruling, well, what happened to the princes that didn't get a chance to be king? See? Well, they could take a group of people and go over there, and they founded Troy. They founded Athens, other Greek city-states across there, Miletus, right? Those are all Zara, Judah, and Dan tribe. Dan, well, we'll get way into Dan a little bit later. He scouted out the whole area across northwest Europe into the British Isles, naming names of rivers after himself as he went. Towns and rivers and islands. Sardinia is Sardania. Denmark is Dan's place. Denmark. Okay? The Danube River. Okay? So as I said, the Pharaoh was the only one left after the Exodus to supply the bloodline to go back into Palestine. But these Zarahites had established all these cities and stuff, and Athens, the Greeks and the Trojans, you know, they're fighting against each other. Well, the Trojans, they were all Zara Greeks and Dan tribes, Danites. The Argive Dani of history are the Danites. Okay. Well, the Trojan Wars were happening and stuff, and the king's son, Brutus, was involved. And at one point in history, and we'll get into that in detail, at one point in history, he takes a big fleet of ships and a whole bunch of people and goes across the Mediterranean, stops at Spain, picks up some old relatives that are already there, goes out of Gibraltar and up into Britain. He goes up the Thames River. And he founds a city. When he finds a nice place, he founds a city called New Troy. New Troy. And 1,000 years later, the Romans come in and they rename it to London. London. There's a rock in Totnes, England, dated 1103 BC, which is said to be the place where Brutus landed. He's a Zara king already there. You know, he's there 1,000 years before the Celts even show up. See? That story is detailed out by Geoffrey of Monmouth. A lot of people don't want to accept that. No, he was a dreamer. But because it all fits into the whole big tapestry that God put together about the lost tribes, we can verify that it's true. We can say that happened. And there's a lot more, way more. There's a reason why the lost tribes went there. God's reason. We'll get to that. Right? Trojan Wars. And the lines were split, right? Zara left, Pharez was over in Palestine. Now, because of Zedekiah's daughter, the Pharez line and the Zara line of the Milesian king of Ireland are back together. It's all one. Both lines are together now. And if you look in history, those two supplied the bloodline for all of Northwest Europe and the British Isles and all the kings and queens over there. They used to call Victoria the grandmother of all the kings and queens of Northwest Europe, which is true. They're all related. They were all related from different migrations out of that area and migrations over there. You know, I've got a big, huge chart I'll show you later on. How much time we got here? A little bit of time. We talked about the rock, okay? That rock that Jeremiah brought to Ireland. The other thing that he brought to Ireland was David's harp. Look on the Irish flag. There's David's harp. Right. Okay? And Dr. Scott always used to point out, how many Jerrys are they in Ireland? Oh, there's 1 million Jerrys in Ireland. Why? Where do they get the name Jerry from? From Jeremiah, you know? Okay. What's the stone look like? Maybe you've never seen it. It's a big pillow-looking thing. It's about 1 foot thick, a couple of feet wide, and about 3 feet long. It weighs 300 pounds. And it's got 2 rings, metal rings, that are nailed into it on the sides, and across the top is a big groove. It's just a big groove. It's about that deep, because they took a pole and put through the 2 rings and then carried the rock along for 40 years in the desert. That's the rock. You find that rock in Scripture. It doesn't say this is Jacob's pillow, but it's always the rock. God doesn't say, hit that rock, hit a rock, and the water will come out. He says, hit the rock. He says, take the rock, put it at the front, at the door to the tabernacle. The rock. So it's always the same rock. They carried it with them the whole time, okay? It got stolen one time, broken in half, and all that stuff. But again, people said, oh, well, now it's back in Scotland. Prophecy can't be true. No, it's true. The throne, the actual throne, is what it symbolizes. And the throne is Queen Elizabeth. You know, Queen Elizabeth. Anywhere there you find a big group of Israelites, you're going to find Judahites, line of David, ruling over them. All of our presidents are out of that line. All of them. Look it up. You know? Hey. Okay. We have enough time to talk about the wrap up. But you see, all of this stuff proves God's faithfulness to keep his promises. Not only just to Abraham, okay? Remember the big population group? All the Celts, Scythians, the Christian nations, the Caucasian, not the blacks, not the Chinese, not a huge population group, the Christian, the white people, okay? That happened. Wow. They possessed the gates of their enemies. Wow. You know, the British Empire is a whole company of nations. Wow. The United States is the greatest nation ever, a single nation. Wow. It all came true. Wow. I guess God must be real. Right? Because didn't he tell Abraham that 4,000 years ago? Abraham was born around 2000 BC. 4,000 years ago, he said, possess the gates of your enemies. And it was only 150 or so years after that that Isaac got that same promise through his wife Rebekah, when she was prophesied to own the gates of their enemies. Proves God's faithfulness. And Paul, who is the interpreter of the Old Testament, he spent 3 years in the desert before he came back to Jericho, being taught by the risen Christ. By the risen Christ. And you can find a couple of places where he says, he said this to me personally. My words, but that's what he says. Okay? He's the interpreter of the Old Testament. I mean, if there's any messianic book, it's Isaiah. And the Jews recognize that that's the messianic book. But they didn't connect it to Jesus. As detailed as it possibly could get, you know, about being marred and hands and feet, and no bones broken, and all of these prophecies about Christ that were fulfilled with Jesus. No, that's not him. That's not him. Can't be him. You know, he's coming. He's coming to save the world and all of that. Oh, man, that can't be him. Well, Jesus taught Paul the Old Testament. See, even though he was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, okay, the greatest scholar of the time and everything, he had the wrong slant on it. He was looking in through the side window the whole time and couldn't see what was going on. Right? Paul says that all of the promises of the Bible, of God, are in him, meaning Jesus. He says, Jesus is the way here, okay? Because every promise that God ever made to anybody, any place in the Bible, and make it pertain to you. There's one promise in Deuteronomy 33:25. It says, as thy day, he's talking to the family of Asher, okay? Moses is talking to Asher as God's mouthpiece, telling the tribes what's going to happen to him. And he says, Asher, as thy day, so shall thy strength be. Whatever's going to happen today, you'll have enough strength. God has promised that you'll have enough strength for the day. If you have a lot of strength, something bad's going to happen. Not really, but you can take that promise. And you can feel rotten about, I can't go to work today because, but I really need to. And God, I'm claiming your promise of healing. As thy day, so shall thy strength be. Get me through the day, okay, God? I'm going to take the first move. You make the first move. If God really didn't want you to go to work, maybe you'd throw up again. I don't know. But you wouldn't be able to go to work. See? You couldn't drag yourself in. See? You can appropriate any of those promises, and we'll go into those, the scriptural references of those promises and the results of the fact that God is real and keeps his word. We'll get into that in the next, in the segments at the end. So that's the wrap-up of the overview. A lot of stuff was left out, you know, even the tribe of Dan and a lot of stuff like that. We'll get into a lot of that in detail. Thanks a lot for watching. God bless.